welcome to the latest Scots Whay Hae podcast, which is the second of our Paisley Book Festival podcasts. And today I'm joined by writers Alan Bissett and Brian Conaghan. Hello, both.
Hello.
Hi, Alison.
And you're involved in a panel at the festival with the young teen author Graeme Armstrong called Scottish Masculinities. Before we delve deeply into that, can you tell us a bit about your latest books, both of which are relevant to that subject? Alan, let's start with you.
So I've written a book called Lads, A Guide to Respect and Consent. Bing. And it's my first non-fiction book, and it's essentially a toolkit for young guys about how to traverse some of the difficult terrain that they're going to find themselves in as they become men, mainly to do with their relationship to women and girls, and how to try and avoid falling into the pitfalls of misogyny and some of the other traps that lie in wait for all men as they grow up. And it's really about talking about subjects like, pornography, boundaries, consent, locker room talk, the kind of stuff that guys are all very familiar with. So I figured I would look back on a few decades of experience now and try and learn from my own mistakes and the mistakes of almost every man I know, and think about the advice that I'm going to give my own sons when they become teenage boys one day.
I was going to ask you, what inspired you to write it, but was that part of it? Being a dad now and thinking, I want to kind of have some advice.
Yeah, that was definitely part of it. But also it came from a campaign run by Police Scotland maybe about 3 years ago called Don't Be That Guy. And I was one of the people who worked in the video for that. And it was essentially, when it comes to the issue of female safety, usually it's advice given to women about how to keep themselves safe. And Police Scotland wanted to talk to the guys about maybe some of the behaviour that they were engaging with that has the knock-on effect of making women and girls feel unsafe. And once that video came out and went viral, I was approached by the publishers to turn it into a book. And that's where that came from. So it's the first time I've ever been approached to write a book. Usually you go to a publisher and pitch something, but they came to me and I was like, oh, do I want to write that? And that's when I started thinking about my sons and the sort of advice I'd want to give them in a few years' time.
And Brian, your novel is Treacle Town. Why did you want to write that?
Unlike Alan, I should have had my book. Yeah, so it's, why did I want to write that?
Yeah, what inspired it then? What inspired you to write it?
Well, I had just recently moved back to my hometown of Coatbridge after being away for over 20 years. And I wanted to write about the teenagers in this town because they were very different from the teenagers that I grew up with when I was living here, but also they were very similar. And I wanted to write about my own experience about gang culture in Coatbridge, and I wanted to write about what it's like to feel isolated, what it's like to feel like you've got no voice, you've got no opportunities, and what young people are going through in these towns. Alan will know, coming from Falkirk, but these essential towns around where I live in Lanarkshire, and the desire to get out of them. But also when you are out of them, they've got such a strong pullback for you. They've got such a strong draw, and it kind of defines you. And I wanted to write about, it's very much maligned, these towns, and I wanted to write about the kind of cultural energy of them as well. So that was a kind of inspiration.
That's interesting that you said that the teenagers you're looking at now are slightly different. What are the differences?
Well, our world has changed, we've lost that. I think we've lost a sense of community. And I see it in this town. I don't see gangs of kids playing football, gangs of kids out and about. I don't see that. And I think it's probably something to do with we live very isolated lives. And we're connected with our social media, obviously. But that's one of the biggest differences. What was significant when I was growing up was the sectarian violence in this town. And that is now sadly, that's creeping into our culture again.
All right, interesting to see. Yeah.
And I mean, you just see it with the paraphernalia, and you just hear it in the streets here. But I think that is something that is sadly slowly creeping up, and it's a similarity when I was a kid.
And Alan, although this is non-fiction that you've written, in the past you've written books which do deal with masculinities, right from Boy Racers, right from the beginning, you did that. Is that something you've noticed changing as well?
What in particular I've noticed?
In terms of Brian saying how he's noticed changes in Coatbridge, and I know you're not in Falkirk anymore, but in terms of the way that, as you've written your novels in particular, are they always about kind of individuals, or are there themes of masculinity running through that you have seen have changed?
Definitely. Yeah. Well, as you said, Boy Racers, which now came out 23 years ago or something like that, and was very much a book of its moment. That book would be very different if it was written now, because, as Brian was pointing out, their world would be very different now. They'd be on social media a lot more, and maybe instead of being out driving around in a car every night, they maybe wouldn't even be doing that. The whole premise of the book might be completely different if it was published these days. But yeah, I've been writing about men essentially my whole career. All of my novels have been focused on men and the way that they interact with each other, the way that they interact with women. And so this book felt like it was kind of naturally flowing out of that. But this is really the first book that I've ever written about the way that men interact with the internet. So coming back to what you're saying about the world having changed since we were young, essentially, a lot of the difficulties that young people face are to do with the way that they interact with the online sphere, which isn't something that we ever had to worry about. There was only one reality when we were young. And young people these days have to contend with multiple realities. So that's partly some of the stuff that I'm tackling, yeah.
And the way that Lads is written is, you know, because it's got kind of bullet points, and I mean, it's called a toolkit. How would you expect people to use that toolkit? Did you have that in mind?
Well, first of all, I would expect them to read it and possibly think about some of the ways that they've behaved in the past, some of the behaviour that they've witnessed in the past, and rather than just accepting it, maybe look at it with fresh eyes. That's what I would hope that the book would do, is encourage young guys to look at the world that they've grown up in with fresh eyes, and sometimes through the eyes of females, because we're not really encouraged to do that very often as men, look at the world through a female eye. It's not very easy for us to do that, obviously, because men and women inhabit themselves quite different realities a lot of the time. But sometimes I'm getting them to pause and say, well, if you were a girl in this situation, what would this feel like? Rather than just the sort of thing that makes them shrug and go, oh, well, it wasn't that big a deal, was it? So, yeah, that's where I'm coming from.
And Brian, in terms of readership, did you have an expectation of who your readers would be? The reason I'm asking that is I've spoken to Graeme Armstrong in the past about the young team, and he was delighted that some of the folk he would be writing about, or at least from a similar background to him, were actually reading the book, which maybe isn't always the case. What was your expectations of a readership, if you had one?
Well, I mean, I spent a great number of years as a teacher, Alistair, so I guess when I'm writing books, I mean, I essentially write for young adults. When I'm writing books, I've got certain a certain demographic in my mind, a certain reluctant readers, basically. Someone once asked me, who do you write books for? And I says, people who don't like reading. I think that's always in my mind. And I've always got that teaching experience in my head as well for kids who just hate reading, hate books, don't see themselves in books, don't see their settings in books, don't see the humour that they exude in books, and don't see their kind of social class in books as well. So I know, for example, all my books are not going to be well received in certain parts of the United Kingdom, and that's proven to be the case. You know, I've had a few books banned. I've had one of my books banned in every single school in England and Wales.
What a badge of honour that is.
Yeah. So this book, for example, I know that it's not going to. I know that it's not going to see. It's not going to be well received in certain parts of England, let's say. I mean, my editor did point out that I've used the C word 133 times in it. And you're going to get, and I think, Alan, you used to teach, Alan, didn't you? You know that that's, you would just be inviting a barrage of parental phone calls if you handed that into the hands of wee Chloe or Simon. But I've got, in all honesty, I feel really passionate about the working classes, and I feel passionate about the accessibility of literature. And now that I'm not going to say I'm giving them that, but I want them to enjoy reading. I want them to enjoy books. I want them to enjoy words. You know, and it's and whatever that takes, it's a gateway to something else. Because we're forgotten about it. I mean, it's just a fact. You know, they're still the literature that's still in the curriculum is unbelievably unadvanced for these kids.
I mean, does that mean that some of your books are literally kind of under the counter? You know, people talk about them in whispers, kind of get them.
No, but what they are is accessible.
Yeah.
You know?
But what about when you say they're accessible, if they're banned by schools, how are they, you know, they have to find them elsewhere then?
Well, what I mean is the language in them is accessible, the characters in them are
yes,
accessible.
I know.
Stories, you know. And I mean, I hate this term, but you've been called an issue writer. I hate that because every book's about an issue. But I like, as a teacher, I loved reading kids and I loved talking about the books. I love the debate around the books. And that's what I like to, I've got that in mind as well when I'm writing, that I want to ignite a debate, and I can see that and hear that debate happening in a classroom. And if you can create an opinion through your books or through any form of literature, I think that's a powerful thing for young people.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we'll return to your books later on, but I know you've been working on a project in Renfrewshire schools, you, Alan and Graeme. Can you talk a little bit about that? Alan, how did you get involved in that?
Well, I was approached to be part of it, and I think it's been run in conjunction with Glasgow Libraries, Renfrewshire Libraries, and the Paisley Book Festival. And they've essentially chosen myself, Brian, and Graeme as people who I'm guessing they feel might be relatable to young people. Not that any of us are anything like their age, but in terms of the subject matter that we're writing about, and maybe even our method of delivery, they might feel that the young people have got a chance of connecting with what we're saying. So I think I've done maybe 7 or 8 schools already. Brian's done a few. We're sort of like leapfrogging. So I'll go into a school that Brian's just been in, and I'm guessing Graeme's going to follow me. And it's been a different experience in every single school. You never know what it's going to be like. You just have to take the audience that's in front of you. And sometimes you can feel that they're actually a wee bit resistant, especially given what I'm trying to talk to them about. It's a fine line I've got to walk, because I want to try and get the message through, especially to the young guys. But you can't alienate them. If you feel that, you know, they get the impression that you're just wagging your finger at them, they're going to bring a wall down, and it's going to be counterproductive. So you've got to kind of like bring them on side, but no so far on side that they're never uncomfortable, because I'm asking them to think a wee bit about the world that they're in and their place in it. So that's a challenge I'm quite up for. I quite enjoy that. Like Brian, I used to be a teacher, so I don't find groups of young people in that setting particularly intimidating, but it's not to say that it's no without its challenges.
It's got its challenges.
Uh-huh.
It's interesting, Alan. I was reading lads last night, and often in the book, you're almost catching yourself going, I'm not being preachy here. I'm not being, you know, you're almost, you're undercutting what anybody might be thinking in an audience, if you like.
Well, you've got to think about how you yourself would have reacted.
Yeah.
You know, if I was a teenage boy in that audience and a middle-aged man was to come in and say, right, guys, you all need to do better, what would my reaction be? I'd be like, well, you don't know me. Who are you? What makes you a moral authority? And I have to try and make it clear to them that I'm not a moral authority. I and every guy I know has at some point made a total arse of it. There isn't a man alive that's never made some women somewhere feel uncomfortable. You know, it's just unrealistic to think otherwise. So I'll let them know that this is me trying to learn from my own mistakes, as well as trying to, you know, pass on some advice. The only reason I can give that advice is because I've tried to cogitate upon my own mistakes. But the reactions have certainly been interesting.
And Brian, what do you concentrate when you're doing these schools visits?
Well, I've now finished them all, so I've done the Glasgow and the Renfrewshire, and I've got to say they've been very different. I mean, as Alan alluded to, that every school is a different challenge, but I always find that I start with a PowerPoint and it's got my sort of books on it, and sometimes you can feel a collective sigh, you know, oh God, this stranger is going to talk about books. something that we're completely disengaged with. But what I don't do is talk about books, and I don't talk about how you should all be great readers and how books are amazing. I talk about my own journey, and I try and engage them in that. I also engage them in the fact that, you know, as Alan said, you know, that some teenagers don't believe that we were teenagers.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, we have sat in their position at one point in our life. But when they find out a little bit about my own journey, that I was kind of kicked out of school, I hadn't read a book until I was in my 20s. And that level of empathy makes people sit up. And I think if you can create that, and you can create a strong connection with people, they'll listen to you without patronising them. You know, I'm not there to tell them to read and say you must read my books as well, because I don't do that. But I think when you talk to kids on a human level and you talk to them respectfully, they engage with you. You know, they really do. I had a very funny experience in Castlehead High School, and there was a kind of brash young lady in the audience, and after the question, she just put up her hand and she just went through my books and went, "I've read that. That was okay. I've read that. That was good. I've read that. That was pish. I read that one." And you think, you know, what a very honest review, you know, and very humbling, and I kind of like that.
And it's, yeah, no, absolutely. And you both mentioned that the responses are different where you go. I'm guessing that's because every class, you'll know as being teachers, every class must be different every year. The dynamics quickly form and all of that stuff.
I mean, if you're going to a school directly after lunchtime, right, you know that the dynamic is going to be different because they're full of sugar and iron brew and full of life. If you're going to a school first thing in the morning, they're all a bit more sedate. I mean, it is that kind of interesting dynamic that you get.
Mm-hmm.
There are certain schools you make a judgment of as well. You can go into a school. I mean, I went to a school in the East End of Glasgow, which had been in the papers and in the national press because of its level of violence in the school. And you make a judgment about that. So you've got your antennas up a little bit more. But it was fantastic, you know. And similarly, you can go into a different school and your expectations are up here and they're never met.
Yeah, that's really interesting because it makes you realise that everyone's bringing expectations to it. If you're saying, right, this afternoon you're going to hear from a writer and their expectations will be there and they'll know what their own reputation is, particularly, you know, if it's a school that's had a bit of attention, all of those things kind of are thrown into the mix.
Yeah, and you also make your own judgments as well, you know. And sometimes I've had to sort of slap myself and be very aware of that and conscious of that.
And Alan, what's the response been to lads when you have talked about it with its target audience?
Well, a lot depends on whether or not it's just boys I'm talking to, because sometimes the teachers make sure that I'm only going to talk to the boys and take the girls away and do something else with them. So if it's a mixed group, that changes the dynamic a little bit. You tend to find the boys show off a wee bit more when the girls are there. But when it's just boys, they tend to be a bit more respectful. You always get wee pockets of resistance, you know, boys that are kind of like rolling their eyes or sniggering or talking or trying to be the clown. And I can deal with that partly because I used to be a teacher, but also partly because I know what they're doing. They're testing me. It's a guy thing. You know, they're looking to see if I'm weak. You know, I'm actually going to say, boys, calm down a wee bit. You know, like work with me here, or am I going to ignore it and back away and shrink? But you have to treat each one on a case by case basis. Sometimes you might have to be a wee bit firmer with them. Other times you might banter and realise that that's going to be what brings them round. But I'll tell you what's really interesting, and I don't know if Brian said this as well. When it comes to Scottish masculinities, there's a question that I'm asked every single time I go into a school, and I finish the talk and I say, "Anybody got any questions?" Every single time. What's the question, Brian?
I think it's what football team do you support?
What football team do you support? I have never been asked that.
I get that all the time.
And it's really interesting that that's the thing that they need to know more than anything else. They're trying to sort you into a tribe.
Yeah.
Do you answer?
That's been going on. That's been going on for, you know, I can remember what was it, an Edwin Morgan piece way back that I was doing for school, and that was one of the questions in that, you know. But are you a Celtic Partick Thistle fan, or are you a Rangers Partick Thistle fan?
Well, basically in this part of the world, they want to know if you're a Celtic or a Rangers fan. That's what they're after.
Yeah.
I always answer. First of all, I engage it. You know, if it's a confrontational question, I always answer truthfully. You know, but I was in a school in the East End of Glasgow, under the shadows of Celtic Park, and I was asked this question, and I just thought, you know, what does it matter? You know, are you going to define me if I say one thing or the other? So if I say one word, then that's me put in a box. You know, so I just said Albion Rovers, and it kind of flummoxed them.
The response I give them is I say, well, obviously in Scotland, there's only 3 answers to that question. Rangers, Celtic, or your local team.
Yeah.
I support one of them.
Yeah.
And you can see them blinking a bit, and then they're like, well, what one? And I'm like, I'm not telling you for the very reason that you just said, because then they'll sort me into a tribe, and they'll either go, oh, he's one of us, or they'll go, oh, he's one of them. And everything that I've said up until this point will become completely immaterial, because you've now just defined me as something, as one of you, or as one of them, and that's all that seems to matter. So I try not to get into it with them. It drives them nuts, right enough.
It does. It does. Sometimes, you know, like obviously there's an Old Firm game at the weekend. If we were doing school visits this week, that would be very much part of the questioning and answer session, wouldn't it?
Mm-hmm. And then they'll try and read you. They'll look at the clothes that you're wearing.
Exactly.
And they'll try and work it out for there. They'll become amateur detectives.
But that kind of reading deeply into people, that's an interesting thing for them to be doing. Anyway, I was thinking in terms of books, what Scottish titles examine masculinity in a new and an interesting way, or even in problematic ways? Do you have ones that kind of spring to mind?
Yeah, I mean, I think actually, I remember Alan wrote a book about Rangers fans going to Manchester. And at the time I was teaching in Dublin. And I put this book on our curriculum in Dublin.
All right.
And the kids, again, it was all for reluctant readers, but the kids were so interested in these people who were the same as them, the same sort of social class, same demographic, but just from a different country. And they couldn't get their head around this, and they kind of loved it because, I guess in Ireland they don't have that culture of football fans travelling up and down their country to follow their team. And of course Graeme isn't here, but Graeme's books are a real modern text to examine male masculinity. Absolutely.
Yeah, it is, and has become. I know Graeme isn't here, but let's talk about the book a little bit, because it's become a phenomenon in a way in its success, and it's been so visual. It's been talked about and written about, and most importantly, read as well.
Yeah,
and that's something that it must have made an impact on yourself.
Well, I mean, it's just great to see a book like that coming out and being such a success, because often in the publishing industry we're told that books like that can't succeed.
Yeah.
And yet there's all these books that defy that. And it's really become this generation's train spotting. So the sort of impact that train spotting would have had probably on all of us, you know, a book that came out of nowhere, no marketing budget behind it, but just became a word-of-mouth phenomenon because it was about the sort of people that aren't usually written about in literature. I think the young team has done the same. There are people who thought that, as Brian was talking about earlier, books weren't for them. And there they are. Their world is absolutely represented in a way that they recognise in their own language as well, which I think is also very important.
Yeah.
I think if the young team had been written in standard English, it wouldn't have been quite the same book. The fact that it's written in that first person, retched straight for the gullet kind of dialect, I think has a real impact on the people who it's about and who are picking it up now. But so I like what Graeme's doing. I like what Brian's doing as well. The sort of stuff that is about young people's lives and the way that they live them. I would find it quite difficult to write that book now because I'm not really actually around very many teenagers. So my boys aren't old enough yet. To be honest, give me another 10 years and I'll be able to tell you.
I'll come to you, Alan. I think another thing about Graeme's book is that there's a huge diversity of people who are reading it.
Yeah.
Like my mum's read it.
Right.
And I think also because it isn't Glasgow centric or Edinburgh, it's not one of the big cities. It's a Lanarkshire town. It makes it really, really appealing. I mean, maybe it's appealing to me because I'm from one of these towns, but I just see a lot of diverse people reading it and engaging with it.
And
I also like.
sorry.
No,
you go on.
I was going to say I also like what Andrew Hagan's doing because he's from a Scottish working class background, but he has obviously risen to a point where he is mixing with, quite frankly, very, very wealthy people. And so he's able to examine masculinity through all the different layers of society in a way that I'm not capable of doing. And I think about like mayflies, and also I'm reading his new book, Caledonian Road, which is about a Scottish writer in London.
600-page.
Yeah. Aye, and I think he's really good at writing about Scottish working class masculinity, but also the sensitivities of it and the intellectual aspect as well, because we have this idea that, Scottish working class men are all thick as mince and the only thing they want to talk about is fighting and shagging and beer and football. But of course, we all know that's not true. Scottish working class men are capable of having very intelligent discussions about politics and culture and music and all sorts of things. And I think he's really good at showing the breadth of that experience.
Yeah. I mean, not to bring this back to my own book, but I'm just piggybacking on Alan. I mean, the main character in my book, I mean, this is what's really important to me, is that working class people, not just teenage kids, but working class people are defined for a certain element. And I'm always saying to students that I'm talking to, our communities have provided the world with some of the brilliant cultural things: music, art, theatre, filmmaking. It's insurmountable. And the main character in my book engages with poetry, and he has to hide that from his mates, and he sees that poetry world as his way out of Coatbridge. And still we're hiding from it. I remember when I was a kid, I used to put my hood up and put a scarf around my face. I say I was a kid, I was in my early 20s, when I was going to Coatbridge Library, because I didn't want anybody to see me going in there. It's ridiculous, isn't it?
What were the books that you discovered in there that took you on that journey?
I was there to do adult literacy classes, Alan.
Right.
So I was actually literally going in there to read again, to learn to read. But the book, I mean, honestly, the first real book that I discovered that I thought, wow, this is the first time people have written about me and my community, other than Trainspotting, which was the first book that me and my friends spoke about. We'd never spoken about a book ever in our lives. And it was the first time I heard conversations around a piece of writing. But the first book that really got me was a Coatbridge writer called Des Dillon.
Oh, aye.
And Des was a couple of years above us at school, and he won't mind me saying this, but he was an absolute rogue. And he came from every community's got these families, these big families, and you're terrified of them. and Des's family were not dissimilar to that. But he wrote about his first novel, Me and My Gal.
Mm-hmm.
I read that, and I was reading places that I'd been to, and I've never done that before, and it's such a huge impact upon me. Not that I wanted to be a writer, but I wanted to read books, more books about that.
He's a terrific writer, Des, and actually, I don't think he quite gets his due. You know,
Never.
he's
No.
really underrated. I mean, he's had that huge theatrical hit,
Yeah.
singing "I'm Not Billy, He's a Tim," and that's been playing in theatres, packed houses for, God, I think about maybe 15 years now.
Yeah.
That'll never go away. But his books, I remember reading Duck, Me and My Gal as well.
Yep.
And what I loved about Des's work was it was about Scottish working class guys, but there was an energy about it.
Yeah.
You know, that it was fast paced and, you know, it was fizzy.
Yeah.
And often, sometimes we just presume that books about working class Scottish people have to be miserable. And it's no that he shies away from that aspect of things, but it's overwritten by this absolutely furiously energetic narrative voice, which
Yeah.
makes it seem as though being working class is the best in the world. And that was a big influence on Boy Racers, to be quite honest. So I'm
And
glad.
there's a real poeticism about his writing as well that he doesn't get. I totally agree with you, Alan. He never gets his credit when we're talking about great Scottish writers, because Des is right up there. But maybe he's thrown a hand grenade in himself into, because I think his last book was called Cunt.
Aye, that sounds like him.
So and it's a brilliant piece of work.
I'll
But
have to check
it's
that
never
out.
going to get a bookshop, is it?
No.
But you know, Alan, you mentioned the stereotypical working class character that people have an imagination of, whether it's, you know, going back to, I was thinking about Glasgow in particular, because there were so many examples of actually when you dig into the characters, they are complex and they are nuanced, a lot of them. Even going back to Laidlaw, who people see as a kind of hard man, but he's a smart guy, and he's, you know, and then I was thinking about Kelman's characters, bus conductor Hines, it's a very complex kind of male character, and then Rilke in Louise Welsh's The Cutting Room, more recently Shuggie Bain, we talked about the young team. These aren't stereotypical depictions of masculinity. They're actually really varied and interesting. And I wonder, it's a shame that that stereotype still persists, because I think the reality is actually quite different. I don't know if you agree.
I mean, I would agree. In the same way that any community is more complex than it appears to the naked eye. If you're from that community and you live in it, then you see all the different levels. But if you're observing it from a distance, it probably seems easy to caricature. And we all do that to an extent with communities that we're no part of. You know, people do it all the time with football supporters. That's one of the reasons why I try not to engage with what football team do you support question when in schools, because then they'll start to typify me.
Yeah.
And I'm trying to resist that a little bit. And I think that's why it's really important that different works of literature are written from the different social communities, so that people from the inside of that can show the rest of the world, look, this is a lot more complex than you think it is.
Yeah, and Brian, you were talking about the kind of what people's ideas of towns, but for me, my thoughts are often that the real art and culture often comes from these towns, doesn't necessarily come from the big cities, which are often real melting pots of all different people on the move, coming in, leaving, that sort of thing. Coatbridge and Airdrie itself, you think of the music, you think of the writers, you think of all sorts of things that have come out. Falkirk, East Kilbride up the road from me, all sorts of these places, which that seems to be where the culture almost thrives and come out. And I don't know if you would agree with that, Brian.
100%, you know, and I think, I mean, somebody like David Keenan, who writes about Airdrie and Coatbridge, you know, he's a great academic mind. He's got a great poetic mind. His characters have got the philosophical heft that Kelman's characters have got, and I think that gets lost as well in this sort of oeuvre of working class characters, working class books, if you like. There's a real level of philosophy in it and deep-rooted thinking it's not just kind of this binary thing as this is my town. It's a bit shit. I want to escape from it and do something that is less shit. You know, I think some of the great novels that are set here, and I think maybe Graeme does this very well, that he examines his setting very well. Whereas I know in my books, I think, right, I'm more, I need to get away from here. But I like the books that David Keenan does that as well. He examines the setting, and the setting forms who your character is.
I mean,
But
David had a real almost celebration of that, you know, really
oh
celebrate
yeah,
the place and the people as well.
yeah, especially with this as a memorial device,
Yeah.
which I mean essentially is I mean it's a work of fiction. It's not when I first read that book, I thought it was. I'm thinking, I've never heard of this band. I grew up in that same era. I never heard of these bands.
Yeah.
But it just draws you into the great art that he's created, you know, and you just think, God, these people in these towns are great thinkers, they're great artists, they're great creatives, and sometimes it's lost.
And you mentioned that, you know, you're often trying to speak to people who maybe don't think they're readers or don't, you know, books kind of, the idea of books turn them off, but there's been other media which also affects the idea of Scottish masculinity. I was thinking some of the first things like a Peter McDougall play and think, oh,
Yeah.
God, is that what, you know,
Yeah.
is that what Scottish masculinity is? But then you've got softer versions of that like John Byrne, Billy Connolly himself. You've mentioned Trainspotting, the film as much as the books. And Alan, you mentioned mayflies. I think mayflies is really interesting because that is something which I still think it's maybe not as rare. Friendship, Scottish masculine friendships that are developed in the way that does so beautifully in the way that Andrew Hagan does. Actually, before I go into that, Alan, in young adult fiction, Brian, there are people that have done that. Sonny and Me by Ross Sayers has got that kind of, again, it's about friendships. Is that something that you see more in young adult fiction than maybe in adult fiction, for want of a better term?
You definitely see it a lot in young adult fiction. But I guess every single book, I mean, every single book that's been written is about love and death. Arguably, is about love and death. But every book's about relationships.
Yeah.
But I think young male relationships might be a little bit rarer. And I guess I write a lot about young male relationships because my friendships are very, very important to me. And my friendships from my youth are very important to me. And there's such a, I think somebody my age writing about that in the past, there's such a rich tapestry to go upon.
And Alan, actually, I'm thinking about your novels, and a lot of them are based around friendships, aren't they? That kind of almost defines a lot of what's going on.
Well, Boy Racers and Pac-Men are about the same group of friends who've known each other quite a long time and grew up in the same scheme. And obviously, as we all know from our own lives, time and the change in circumstances change the dynamic within friendship groups. You know, different fault lines emerge and different pressures, and sometimes people become closer and sometimes they drift apart. And that's what those two books together are trying to look at. And also what happens when some people from a friendship group that might be based on geography or class leave.
Yeah.
How does that affect things? I mean, the difference between Boy Racers and Pac-Men is that two of the guys have left. One of them's coming back in and doesn't quite fit in the same way that he used to do. And we've probably all got friendships that we can look back on and see a similar dynamic at work. And we men, obviously, it's much more difficult for men to write about female friendships. Not impossible because we've observed so many of them, but we're not inside them. I think male friendship is something that's generally underwritten about, as Brian was saying, and especially given there's so much conversation now about male mental health, because men seem to be really struggling. Male friendships are probably more important than ever because that's where you're going to find your safety net.
Yeah.
So it's sort of incumbent upon us to write about these things in a way that feels realistic for male readers out there, and also for female readers who might be reading our work. It's maybe useful for them to learn about what these friendships are like from the inside, because they then immerse themselves in that in the same way we get to immerse ourselves in a female consciousness when we read female readers. That's one of the advantages of reading literature, is that you exist inside somebody else's head for maybe 8, 9, 10, 11 hours. There's no other medium that can do that. And that's why we write and why we read.
And I think that idea of friendship is such an important one. I was also thinking before we spoke, a lot of the the big characters in Scottish literature, certainly in the 20th century, were kind of individuals and almost rejected. You know,
Yeah.
a lot of them have an existential crisis because they were on their own, you know, and, you know, not allowing other people in. And actually, relationships are vital to, you know, kind of understanding, as you say.
Yeah.
I mean,
I mean-
Kelvin's books, that's what they're all about. They're all about individuals who are struggling against their social environment. You don't see a lot about male friendship in James Kelman's books.
No.
Then you get to Irvine Welsh, and Trainspotting is about a friendship group, but it's quite a toxic one in a lot of ways, which is why Renton has to escape it at the end.
Well, Renton almost stays on his own, doesn't he? He kind of keeps him at an arm's length in a way.
Yeah, and by the end, that's extended to the fact that he's ripping them off.
Yeah.
You know, and one of the things I really liked about some of the Trainspotting sequels is what then happens 10, 20 years down the line when Renton has to come back in and face what he's done. That's one of the reasons why people were so interested in the Trainspotting sequel that came out in cinemas. But I think it's also good to have positive representations of male friendships as well.
Yeah.
You know?
No, absolutely. And it's thought, or at least it's said, that there are more open conversations today than previously about many things: mental health, sexuality, identity, masculinity, as we're doing. But do you think that's true, or have you found that's true, or is that a kind of media-created stereotype? Brian, what do you think?
I think in essence it's true. You know, I can only give my own experience. I think one of the things about social media, one of the positive things about social media is that we are bombarded with men should talk about their mental health, men should open up, speak to your friends, speak to your family members, etc. But you know, when I was growing up, we never spoke about that. We never spoke about things like mental health or sexuality, or just feeling a little bit unsure of yourself. The word anxiety was never in the kind of lexicon, you know, when I was younger. And now I see it with my own friendships, that these things are very much part of our discussion, our everyday discussion. You know, and that's a positive step forward. And of course, that's going to feed in and bleed into our youth. And probably Alan's talking about that when he's out at schools. You know, I'm certainly talking about that, but I'm not being didactic enough or to aggressively say you must talk about X, Y, and Z. But there is a forum out there for you to discuss, and that forum is your friends. You know, and if you've got a friend, I mean, this is important as well. If you've got a friend that doesn't want to hear it or is dismissive of you, well, I don't want that person as a friend. That's not what friendship is. But I haven't seen it, and I haven't seen a lot of it in books yet. There's a wee note for you, Alan.
But it's interesting because I think certainly we all had friendships, and I'm using a terrible, terrible inverted comma signs there, which I hate doing. But looking back, they weren't particularly positive friendships, but
yeah,
you know, you were kind of had to be in them anyway. It goes back to what we were talking about before we started recording, and the kind of gang culture and that side of things.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I remember growing up and just feeling pressure to do it, pressure to fight, pressure to make weapons, pressure to drink, you know. And imagine I'm 16 now, and I've had a discussion with two of my mates about my own mental health issues.
Yeah.
And then 2 weeks later, we're down the park, and I don't want to take that swig of Buckfast. They'll support me on that.
Yeah.
But back then, I couldn't. You know, I was terrified of the pressure that it would have taken on me. So, and we always defined ourselves through football, through drinking, through that kind of group horde mentality. And I guess as you get older, like football, I mean, I love football, but it doesn't have the same, I don't have the same passion about it as I once had. It doesn't make me either up or down. Uh, so that I've got a real disconnection with it, and so have all my other pals. And we kind of talk about that. But I think that yeah, I think that our world is changing for the positive in that sense.
What do you think, Alan? Do you think those conversations are improving? Is that your experience when you go around different schools in particular?
Conversations around what specifically?
About identity, about sexuality, mental health, all those things that perhaps we didn't discuss when we were at school.
Yeah, well, I mean, those are three different things. Identity, obviously, there's a lot of conversation around that these days. And I think that's a positive and a negative, because I think a lot of identities which used to be marginalised have now found space in the culture and are much more represented and visible to themselves. And I think that's a good thing. But one of the things I have noticed, especially when it comes to the arts, is people think identity is now everything. You know, like identity is important. I mean, here we are talking about masculinity, Scottishness, class, you know, three white guys.
Yeah.
That is a discussion around identity. But identity isn't the be all and end all. You know, at the end of the day, we're writing about human beings, and human beings are so much more complex than their identity. And I sometimes think identity is maybe at the front of the discussion a bit too much. And identities become weaponized against other identities, and it's, you know, it's no different for supporting a football team. That's sometimes what it comes down to, and it sometimes feels like literature and the arts in general have become a bit like that. So, you know, swings and roundabouts there, really. Sexuality, I think, it's much easier now for people to talk about sexualities that maybe slightly depart from the norm of heterosexuality. That's become, you know, you go into schools now and you see rainbow flags everywhere.
Yeah.
That certainly wouldn't have been the case when we were at school. Obviously, as we all know now, there must have been a significant portion of the people who were in our year at school who were gay. But I can't remember a single person ever coming out as gay when I was at school.
Mm-hmm.
His life probably would have been unlivable for them. And this was like the late 80s and early 90s, when things were starting to change.
Yeah.
But they hadn't reached the schools yet, put it that way. So I think the discussion about sexuality is much more open now. It's easier for guys to talk about these things, which is why I thought it was possible for a book about football supporting pack men, for there to be a bisexual character and scenes of gay sex. You know, I sort of put that in towards the end of the book so that I'd managed to get all the lads all the way through the book before, you know, 20 pages before the end are confronted with a gay sex scene. It's much easier to have these discussions now. Mental health, I think, is I agree with everything Brian said there. You know, I don't think guys have always been afraid of showing weakness, especially in front of other men, and sometimes to say that they're struggling or they're sad or they're feeling fragile or confused would feel like an admission of weakness. But I definitely think the discourse around that has changed now, because you know, look at the male suicide rate. That's where that kind of attitude leads.
Yeah.
You know, men topping themselves because they feel like they can't actually express their emotions properly, or feel that nobody can relate to them and they can't relate to other people. I find as me and my friends have got older, it's much easier now for us to admit our frailties to each other in a way that we couldn't when we were younger.
And do you think that's reflected in young people as well, from going around schools? Do you think that's the case?
Well, because I'm no part of the world, I couldn't answer that question accurately, but I do bring some of these themes up in the talks that I'm doing on this book.
Yes.
And I do talk about the pressures that are on men, and also what we're expected to live up to. You know, we're meant to project strength and power all the time, otherwise we're failures. You know, like nobody can live up to that. No man can live up to that. What does that mean if we don't feel that we're strong or powerful? Does that mean that we don't exist? And I can see them nodding because they feel those pressures. And you've got somebody in front of them, you know, a grown man who's telling them it's all right to feel frail sometimes. They don't have to project strength or power. Maybe the whole idea of the alpha male is a myth. That kind of stuff. I think the fact that they take that as a reassuring message suggests to me that they're cogitating upon some of these things as well.
It's such an interesting discussion, and it's one that, you know, we could have another hours and hours talking about. Of course, that's what can happen. People can go and see you guys at the Scottish Masculinities event. It's on Sunday, the 28th of April at 5 o'clock in the main hall at Paisley Town Hall, which is looking great, I have to say, since it's been done up. Tickets are available at paisleybookfest.com, and the links will be over at Scots Whay Hae website. Since you mentioned Andrew Hagan, I would like to say that I'll be in conversation with him at the festival as well. So I'll put a link on there for that, talking about Caledonia Road. I'm really looking forward to that. Alan, Brian, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me. I really do appreciate it, and I'm really looking forward to seeing you at the Paisley Book Festival.
Pleasure, Alistair. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it was lovely to be here.
And we'll be back soon with someone completely different.